If you just finished Resident Evil Requiem on Switch 2 and need something new to play, here are 25 games that hit that same survival horror sweet spot. Starting off at number 1, Resident Evil Village is probably the most natural next step after Requiem, especially now that it is available as the Gold Edition on Switch 2. The first-person perspective pulls you deep into a gothic nightmare filled with memorable enemies, tense resource management, and some genuinely scary set pieces. It is flashy, atmospheric, and packed with enough content to keep you busy for hours. Coming in at number 2, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard is where Capcom completely reinvented the franchise with a first-person horror experience that felt raw, claustrophobic, and terrifying from start to finish. The Baker family is one of the most unsettling enemy factions in modern survival horror gaming, and that moldy Louisiana farmhouse still manages to get under your skin. It is available on Switch 2 alongside Requiem, and absolutely worth playing. Third on the list is the Silent Hill 2 remake, and if you have not played this yet, you are seriously missing out. Bloober Team rebuilt James Sunderland's Nightmare from the ground up, with over-the-shoulder combat, reworked puzzles, and an expanded foggy town to explore. The psychological horror here hits differently from Resident Evil, but scratches the same itch for tension, exploration, and dread that fans of the genre crave. For Game 4, Alan Wake 2 is a cinematic survival horror masterpiece that plays out like a psychological thriller wrapped inside a horror story. You switch between two protagonists, each dealing with reality unraveling in completely different ways, and the atmosphere is unlike anything else in the genre. It is third-person, story-driven, and packed with the kind of tension and production quality that fans of Resident Evil will immediately appreciate. The Evil Within 2 takes the 5th spot, and honestly deserves way more attention than it gets in 2026 survival horror conversations. Set in an open-world simulation gone wrong, Sebastian Castellanos is back, hunting down horrifying creatures while piecing together a deeply emotional story. The mix of stealth, combat, and resource management is very familiar to Resident Evil fans, and the game rewards careful, strategic play. Number 6 goes to the Dead Space Remake, which proves that deep space horror is every bit as terrifying as haunted mansions and ruined cities. The necromorphs are some of the most creative and grotesque enemies in horror gaming history, and the remake polishes everything to a modern standard without losing the claustrophobic tension that made the original legendary. Strategic dismemberment combat is its own thing entirely, and it works brilliantly. At number 7, the Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly remake is a complete overhaul of one of the most psychologically intense horror games ever made. Instead of a gun, you fight ghosts using a camera, which means you have to actually look directly at them through the viewfinder to defeat them. The sheer dread that mechanic produces is something Resident Evil fans will respect immediately, and the Japanese folklore atmosphere is deeply unsettling in the best possible way. Game number 8 is Reanimal, the new co-op survival horror game from Tarsier Studios, the team behind Little Nightmares. 2 orphan siblings are trapped on a nightmarish island full of oversized, disturbing enemies, and the fairy tale horror aesthetic hits hard. It supports 2-player cooperative play on Switch 2, which makes it one of the best options on this list for playing alongside someone else who shares your love of horror. Amnesia Rebirth lands at number 9 and brings the legendary survival horror series to Switch 2 in fully optimized form. Set in the Algerian desert, you play as Tassi Trianon, slowly uncovering a terrifying mystery while managing your sanity and avoiding monsters you genuinely cannot fight. The atmospheric first-person horror here is some of the most oppressive and stressful in the genre, perfect for players who loved the tension in Resident Evil 7. 10 on the countdown is The Evil Within, the original game from Shinji Mikami, the very person who created Resident Evil. That heritage comes through in every design choice, from the over-the-shoulder perspective to the resource scarcity and the grotesque enemy design. It is harder and grittier than most survival horror games available today, but fans of classic Resident Evil sensibilities will find something deeply familiar and deeply rewarding here. Alien Isolation earns the 11th spot as one of the most suspenseful stealth horror experiences in gaming. You are Amanda Ripley aboard a deteriorating space station being stalked by a single xenomorph that learns from your behavior and cannot be killed. every moment is suffused with dread, and the game demands the same kind of careful inventory management and situational awareness that makes Resident Evil so compelling. Number 12 is Outlast, a relentless first-person horror game set in an abandoned psychiatric facility where your only tool is a video camera with limited batteries. Unlike Resident Evil, you have no weapons, which completely changes the survival dynamic and makes every encounter with the facility's disturbing inhabitants purely about running and hiding. It is brutal, nasty, and genuinely difficult to put down. Crow Country sits at number 13, and it is one of the most charming and genuinely creepy survival horror games of recent years. The retro, low-poly aesthetic is completely intentional and actually heightens the unsettling atmosphere rather than softening it. The gameplay leans hard into classic Resident Evil mechanics, including fixed camera angles in certain areas, resource management, and intricate puzzle solving, making it a clear love letter to the genre. Game 14 is Signalis, a pixel art survival horror game that looks deceptively simple but delivers one of the most haunting and emotionally complex stories in the genre. Drawing heavily from classic Resident Evil structure, including grid-based inventory, tense combat, and interconnected map design, it wraps everything in a surreal science fiction nightmare. If you appreciate atmosphere and storytelling as much as jump scares, this one will stay with you long after the credits roll. At 15, we have Little Nightmares 2, the atmospheric puzzle platformer from Tarsier Studios that turns childhood fears into something truly disturbing. Playing as Mono and Six, navigating a world controlled by a sinister broadcast signal, the game uses scale and perspective to make you feel completely helpless against its monstrous antagonists. The tension, the dread, and the pure survival instinct it triggers put it firmly in the same emotional territory as the best survival horror games. Little Nightmares 3 comes in at number 16, building on everything that made the series great by introducing two-player cooperative gameplay for the first time. The Nowhere setting is imaginative and deeply unsettling, and the new protagonists, Alone and Low, face threats that are even more creative and disturbing than in previous entries. It fits perfectly on Switch 2 and gives horror fans a genuinely unique multiplayer experience rooted in dread and atmosphere. Blair Witch takes the 17th slot as an underrated first-person psychological horror game set in the infamous woods of the Blair Witch universe. You search for a missing boy accompanied only by your dog Bullet, whose well-being directly affects the gameplay and your protagonist's emotional state. The horror builds slowly through environmental storytelling and psychological manipulation rather than jump scares, which makes it a rewarding and deeply unsettling experience. Tormented Souls claims number 18 as a genuine throwback to classic survival horror that unashamedly evokes the earliest Resident Evil and Alone in the Dark games. Fixed camera angles, limited saves, intricate puzzles, and scarce resources are all here in abundance in a gothic hospital setting that oozes dread. For players who grew up with the originals or who discovered those mechanics through Crow Country, this delivers the same formula with genuinely impressive execution. Layers of Fear arrives at number 19, and its psychological horror approach works differently from most games on this list, but is no less effective. You walk through a painter's deteriorating mansion while reality itself warps and twists around you, blending disturbing imagery with an emotionally raw narrative about obsession and madness. The emphasis on atmosphere and psychological dread rather than combat makes it a welcome contrast to more action-oriented survival horror titles. Soma secures the 20th spot as one of the most intellectually and emotionally disturbing horror games ever created by Frictional Games. Set in an underwater research facility with a deeply philosophical story about consciousness and identity, it uses existential dread rather than monsters to generate its most impactful scares. Players who love the narrative depth and atmosphere of the best Resident Evil games will find something uniquely affecting here. Observation earns the 21st position as a sci-fi horror game with a completely original perspective that sets it apart from everything else on this list. You play as an artificial intelligence aboard a space station, trying to help a stranded astronaut figure out what went terrifyingly wrong. The concept is brilliantly executed, and the tension of uncovering the mystery through systems and cameras, rather than direct combat, creates a slow burn horror experience that is genuinely unlike anything else. Heaven Dust 2 steps in at 22 as a compact and surprisingly effective love letter to classic Resident Evil that nails the formula in a smaller package. Set deep inside a research facility filled with zombies, you manage resources, solve puzzles, and explore interconnected environments in a way that feels immediately familiar to anyone who has played the original trilogy. It is not trying to reinvent anything, but it executes the classic survival horror template with real skill and genuine affection for the genre.
At 23, Resident Evil Revelations 2 is a fantastic horror experience that deserves a spotlight here, because many Switch 2 players may have missed it entirely. The game follows two separate campaigns starring Claire Redfield and Barry Burton, respectively, both requiring cooperative puzzle solving with their respective allies. It sits between the old-school tension of classic entries and the more action-oriented later games, giving it a uniquely balanced feel that holds up really well.
Daymare 1998 comes in at number 24 as a loving and surprisingly competent tribute to the Resident Evil 2 and 3 era of survival horror. Third-person over-the-shoulder gameplay, a moody American small town overrun by horrifying mutations, and deliberate reloading mechanics that punish carelessness, all combine to create something that feels genuinely connected to the games that inspired it. It is not as polished as Capcom's Westward, but it delivers the core survival horror loop with enough tension to satisfy. Rounding out the list at 25, The Walking Dead: The Final Season by Telltale Games brings the emotional intensity and constant threat of survival horror to a narrative adventure format that has a deeply satisfying payoff for longtime fans of Clementine's story. Resource scarcity, life or death decisions, and tense action sequences built around the constant threat of walkers give it genuine survival horror credentials. It is a gripping, emotional, and genuinely tense experience that caps this list on a strong and affecting note.